It's 2019, and a passenger rights survey asks travelers to name the single part of a commercial flight they dread the most. It isn't turbulence. It isn't the food. It is a 3-foot by 3-foot room at the back of the plane that most passengers try to use exactly once, and only when they have no other choice. The airplane bathroom is, by almost any measure, the least loved room in modern travel. It's cramped. It's loud. The flush sounds like something is trying to escape. And airlines have spent the last decades making it smaller, not bigger, while everything else about flying has supposedly gotten more comfortable. So how did we end up here? How did the aviation industry go from having no bathrooms at all to building an engineering solution so aggressive it can move waste against gravity through a tube, to now deliberately shrinking that same room on purpose while the aircraft around it gets bigger? That's actually a much stranger story than you'd expect. Let's go back to the very beginning, because for a long time, this problem didn't have a good solution at all. In the earliest days of commercial passenger flight, in the 1920s and into the 1930s, aircraft simply weren't in the air long enough or high enough for anyone to seriously plan around bathroom access. Flights were short, altitudes were low, and cabins were unpressurized, loud, and cold enough that passengers were more focused on staying warm than staying comfortable. As routes got longer, particularly once transatlantic and transcontinental flying boats and airliners entered service in the 1930s, this stopped being a minor inconvenience and became an actual design problem. Some early aircraft manufacturers responded with what can only be described as improvisation, a simple, curtained-off chemical toilet, essentially a bucket with a lid, bolted into whatever corner of the fuselage could spare the space. It worked, technically. It was also, by every account from the era, unpleasant, foul-smelling, and about as far from luxury air travel as you could get, even as airlines were simultaneously marketing that exact phrase to prospective flyers. Passengers on these early long-haul routes often described the lavatory not as a private convenience, but as something closer to a shared inconvenience everyone silently agreed not to discuss. Flight crews on record from the era recall having to manage waste disposal manually at certain stopovers, since some early chemical systems had no onboard disposal mechanism at all and simply needed to be emptied on the ground between legs of a journey. It's a detail that makes clear just how far removed early, glamorous air travel actually was from the polished marketing images of the period. The real transformation didn't come from a bathroom innovation at all. It came from something else entirely: pressurization. Once aircraft like the Boeing 307, and later the first jetliners began flying in pressurized cabins at high altitude, engineers realized they had accidentally been handed a tool they didn't have before: a genuine, controllable pressure differential between the cabin and the outside air. That pressure differential is the entire reason the modern vacuum toilet exists. Rather than relying on gravity and water, the way a bathroom at home works, an aircraft lavatory uses the difference in air pressure to forcefully suck waste through a narrow pipe and into a sealed holding tank at the rear of the aircraft. It is, mechanically, closer to a high-powered vacuum cleaner than a household toilet, and that is exactly why the flush sounds the way it does. A short, violent rush of air doing in half a second what a gravity-fed toilet takes several seconds to accomplish, with far more water. Engineers had to solve a genuinely tricky sealing problem to make this work reliably at altitude. The valve separating the cabin-side bowl from the pressurized exterior tank has to open and close in a fraction of a second, sealing tightly enough that cabin pressure doesn't leak out through the plumbing itself. Something that would have been a non-issue at ground level, but became a serious engineering constraint the moment aircraft started cruising at altitudes where the outside air pressure was a fraction of what passengers were breathing inside the cabin. This wasn't just a nice-to-have upgrade. It solved a genuine engineering problem. Water is heavy, and carrying enough of it to flush a conventional toilet dozens of times across a long-haul flight would have added a meaningful, unnecessary weight penalty, burning extra fuel on every single flight for the entire life of the aircraft. The vacuum system uses only a small rinse of blue sanitizing fluid instead of a full tank flush, and that seemingly tiny difference, multiplied across tens of thousands of flights a year, translates into a serious amount of saved weight and fuel. There's a persistent myth, by the way, worth addressing directly. No, nobody has ever actually been sucked out of an airplane bathroom by the vacuum flush. The suction is strong enough to pull waste through the pipe, not strong enough to pull a person through an opening smaller than the pipe itself. That particular urban legend has outlived several generations of aircraft, despite being physically impossible. Not every part of this story went smoothly, though. Early vacuum toilet systems, introduced widely in the 1980s, occasionally suffered from a genuinely bizarre and embarrassing failure mode: frozen waste tanks. At extreme cruising altitude, temperatures outside the fuselage can drop dramatically, and on rare occasions, waste in the external drain valve would freeze into a solid mass, sometimes large enough that chunks could break free during descent. In a small handful of well-documented incidents across the industry, frozen waste actually detached from an aircraft and struck property on the ground, generating exactly the kind of headline no airline wants attached to its name. The phenomenon even acquired an unofficial nickname among aviation enthusiasts and meteorologists investigating unexplained falling debris: blue ice, named for the tint of the sanitizing fluid mixed into the frozen mass. Engineers responded by improving heating elements around the drain valves and tightening maintenance procedures, and the problem became vanishingly rare. But for a brief period in aviation history, aircraft lavatory, ice falling from the sky, was an actual recorded category of incident that maintenance crews had to account for, and insurance claims occasionally had to quietly settle, without most passengers ever hearing a word about it. If you're the kind of person who wants to actually understand what's happening behind the systems you use every day, that curiosity is worth protecting, whether it's how your airplane bathroom works or what's happening to your data the moment you connect to public Wi-Fi at the airport, waiting for that flight. That's a genuinely useful habit, and it's exactly the kind of thing worth a quick mention from a sponsor here, if you have one lined up for this video. Insert your sponsor segment here. This is the natural breakpoint in the pacing, right after the problem-solved beat and before the modern controversy section. Now, back to the bathroom. Here's the part of the story that genuinely surprises people. Airplane bathrooms today are, on average, smaller than they were 15 years ago on the very same aircraft models. And that shrinkage was not an accident. It was a deliberate business decision. As airlines came under increasing pressure to fit more revenue-generating seats onto every flight, cabin designers were tasked with finding space anywhere they could, and lavatories became one of the easiest targets. Every few inches shaved off the depth of a bathroom wall is a few inches that can be reclaimed for an additional row of seats. And over the length of a single-aisle aircraft flying dozens of times a week, even a single extra seat row can represent a meaningful amount of additional revenue per year, multiplied across an entire fleet and an entire operating lifespan that can stretch 2 decades or more. This is why several airlines have quietly introduced narrower, more angular lavatory designs on their newest aircraft deliveries. Some so tight that larger passengers have publicly complained about being unable to comfortably close the door. Aircraft manufacturers have responded with cabin concepts that reduce the bathroom's footprint by reshaping it around the curve of the fuselage, rather than using a simple rectangular box. squeezing out inches without technically making the interior volumes any smaller on paper, even though it often feels smaller in practice. Some airlines have gone even further, consolidating multiple lavatories at the rear of narrow-body aircraft into a shared, movable wall configuration. Essentially, a set of lavatories separated by lightweight partitions that can be reconfigured between flights depending on how many seats the airline wants to sell on that particular route. On a flight expecting to be full, walls can be adjusted to maximize seating. On a quieter route, the same physical space might be reconfigured slightly differently. It's a level of behind-the-scenes optimization most passengers never notice, precisely because it's designed to be invisible, unless you happen to be the person standing in an unusually narrow doorway, wondering why it feels tighter than it did on your last flight with the same airline. Here's a small detail that trips almost everyone up the first time they hear it. Smoking has been banned on commercial flights since the early 1990s in most of the world. And yet, by law, every airplane bathroom still must contain a functioning ashtray. This isn't an oversight, and it isn't airlines quietly hoping someone will smoke. It's a deliberate safety requirement because aviation regulators learned the hard way that banning an activity does not guarantee compliance. If someone breaks the rule and lights a cigarette anyway, the far more dangerous outcome is that person having nowhere safe to extinguish it, potentially discarding it in a trash bin lined with paper towels, which has been directly linked to onboard fires in the past. The ashtray isn't a concession to smokers. It's a safety net for the moment the rule gets broken anyway. A small, strange artifact of a habit the industry has otherwise completely eliminated. There's another entire chapter to this story that has nothing to do with plumbing at all. The airplane bathroom's strange relationship with aviation security. Because it's the one fully enclosed, lockable space on an aircraft where a passenger can be completely alone and out of sight of crew, regulators and airlines have spent decades treating it as a genuine security consideration, not just a hygiene one. Smoke detectors were made mandatory inside aircraft lavatories, specifically because of the smoking ban, giving crew an automated way to catch violations they couldn't otherwise observe directly. But beyond smoking, the enclosed, private nature of the space has occasionally made it the setting for genuine security incidents, from attempted tampering to smuggling attempts, which is part of why flight attendants are trained to notice unusually long occupancy times, and on some airlines, why lavatories near the cockpit door are treated with additional procedural caution during the flight, particularly around the periods when the cockpit door itself might need to be opened. It's a strange duality. The smallest, most mundane room on the aircraft is simultaneously one of the most carefully thought-through spaces from a security standpoint, precisely because it's the only place on the plane designed to give a passenger real privacy. No honest history of the airplane bathroom would be complete without acknowledging the informal cultural phenomenon that's grown up around it. The so-called Mile High Club, the term for couples who've been intimate on board a flight, almost always in that same cramped lavatory. Airlines and regulators don't officially acknowledge this as anything other than a nuisance and a policy violation, since it typically involves multiple passengers occupying a space designed for one, tying up the lavatory during a flight, and in the most extreme documented cases, drawing formal warnings or removal from the aircraft upon landing. But the phenomenon has become such a persistent piece of aviation folklore that it's referenced constantly in film, television, and casual conversation, to the point that most adult travelers have heard the term, even if they've never set foot near the activity itself. It's a small, telling example of how even the least glamorous room on a plane has managed to accumulate its own layer of pop culture mythology, entirely separate from the engineering story sitting underneath it. The most recent major chapter in this story isn't really about comfort at all. It's about accessibility, and it's a fight that's still actively unfolding. For years, Passengers with disabilities flying on single-aisle aircraft, the most common configuration for domestic and short-haul routes, often had no accessible lavatory available to them at all, because manufacturers and airlines had never been required to include one on that aircraft type. Advocacy groups spent years pushing regulators to change this, arguing that a passenger shouldn't have to choose between flying and being physically unable to use the bathroom for the entire duration of a multi-hour flight. The core of the argument was straightforward, as single-aisle aircraft were increasingly used for longer and longer routes, sometimes 5 or 6 hours or more. A lavatory that only worked for ambulatory passengers effectively excluded an entire category of travelers from certain flights altogether, regardless of how much they were willing to pay for a ticket. Regulators in the United States have since moved to require at least one accessible lavatory on new-build single-aisle aircraft above a certain seating capacity, a change that is being phased in gradually as new aircraft enter airline fleets rather than retrofitted across the entire existing global fleet overnight. That distinction matters. It means a passenger booking a flight today still has no guarantee that the specific aircraft operating their route has been updated, since older airframes already in service are typically allowed to continue flying under the rules that existed when they were built, sometimes for another decade or more before they're retired. Different regions of the world have approached this at different speeds, and aircraft manufacturers have responded by developing modular lavatory designs that can be reconfigured to a wider, wheelchair-accessible layout without requiring an entirely new cabin structure, an engineering compromise aimed at making the retrofit process cheaper and faster for airlines that do choose to upgrade ahead of any legal requirement to do so. The airplane bathroom went from a barely tolerated afterthought to a genuine feat of pressure differential engineering, to a deliberately shrinking piece of real estate sacrificed for one more row of paying passengers, to now the center of an active accessibility debate that regulators are still working through, layered on top of a security apparatus and a piece of pop culture mythology that most passengers never think about while they're standing in line for it. It is easy to walk past that narrow little door, wait your turn, wince at the flush, and never think about it again. But almost everything about that room, its size, its sound, the ashtray you're not supposed to need, the smoke detector quietly watching for rule breakers, and whether there's an accessible version of it at all, is the direct result of decisions airlines and regulators are still actively making today, decades after that first curtained-off bucket was bolted into the corner of a 1930s flying boat cabin. So, what do you think? Should regulators force airlines to make these bathrooms bigger again, even if it means losing seats? Or is a slightly cramped few minutes just the price of cheaper tickets? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.